Believing that you're destined for heaven when you're not would be the most tragic self-deception. David Servant's book, The Great Gospel Deception, will help you be sure that heaven will be your eternal home. Order your copy at HeavenWord.tv.
Well, thank you so much for joining me once again as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. Today we're back in that wonderful epistle of James, what we tend to believe is the earliest epistle that was penned of any of the epistles in the New Testament. So that's why we're in it first of all among all the epistles. We're doing this chronologically, and we're now starting today the 4th chapter of James. But let me set the stage a little bit here. In chapter 3, you'll recall that James had a lot to say about the misuse of the tongue. And clearly, we get the idea from his words in chapter 3 and earlier on about the tongue, because he said, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and doesn't bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. That was like in the first couple of verses of the epistle. We get the idea that there were some problems within the churches that James was writing to, the 12 tribes, the Jewish believers who had been scattered abroad because of the persecution of the church in Jerusalem. And so now it's going to become even more clear that there's problems in those churches. May I also mention in chapter 3, James talked about jealousy and selfish ambition. And that theme is going to surface again here now in chapter 4. So let me say right from the beginning here that if there's one thing that this shows us, it shows us that churches have problems. Hey, surprise, surprise. And why do churches have problems? Because churches are made up of people. And people are imperfect. You say, well, I thought people who are born again, act differently. Well, they do act differently. There's no doubt that the work of the Holy Spirit within every born again person, changes them on the inside. However, we learn from reading, various texts in the New Testament that Christians, although they're changed and transformed on the inside, there's still this residue of their old self, the former self, a self that hasn't really been changed. And so within every true believer, there is a war. Paul talked about the war between the spirit and the flesh and so forth. So it's good to stay, balanced on this. And James is going to give us some balance on what can happen when people let the flesh begin to dominate. Okay, so are you ready? James chapter 4 and verse number 1. He asks this question: what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Well, quarrels and conflicts, in the church, that involves people's mouths and tongues, right? Okay, so you can see how this, although it's a new chapter in James, really, of course, James didn't write it in chapter and verse, and this is the continuation of the themes that have already surfaced in the first 3 chapters. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? So there were quarrels and conflicts amongst James's contemporary readership. Here's his answer: is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? Okay, well, let's pause here for a few minutes and talk about this. The New American Standard Bible, from which I'm reading and quoting here, is one of those translations that the translators did their best to be stringently accurate to the Greek, a word-for-word translation. And that is good in many cases because, you're reading exactly the words, the best word-for-word translation that modern Greek scholarship can come up with, at least the guys that did the New American Standard Bible. And these people are smart and they are scholars. However, let's say that someone learns the English language in a foreign country where English is not spoken. Then they come to America and they begin to, hear an American, or let's just say they come to Great Britain or Australia or New Zealand, any place where English is the predominant language, and hear us speak English. Just because they learned English in their country and got the basic vocabularies of it, doesn't mean they're going to understand everything we have to say, because there's shades of meanings, there's alternate meanings, there's expressions, there's idioms that we use that, are going to be off their radar completely. And that's the danger you run when you get these, strict word-for-word interpretations. And here's one of them. If I ask anybody, what's the source of the quarrels and conflicts among you, chances are you would say, well, it's obvious. It's the source is my pleasures that wage war in my members. That's not what you'd say. You'd probably say, well, because I want my way and they want their way and we both want different ways, and so we get into an argument over it, okay? We're basically selfish in this regard. And so that's, I think, is what's happening here. Accurate translation, but it causes us to scratch our heads. And so here's what I do when I run into these head-scratching verses like this one, the second part of James chapter 4 and verse number 1. I just say, wait a second now, don't get all wrapped up in this, David. You don't have to dive into the Greek then, because if you dive into the Greek, you're going to get something very similar to what they've got, for example, in the New American Standard or the King James, which was a word-for-word translation using English that was used 400 years ago, or the New King James, for that matter, which is a word-for-word translation, that is based on more contemporary English. You have to go into paraphrases, like the New International version certainly tends toward paraphrase. It's not word for word, it's more thought for thought. And those things can be helpful. And, the real stringent Greek guys say, those are inferior translations because there's a lot of leeway for the translators to kind of come up with their own theology and stick it in there and so forth. But thank God we have so many translations. Now, I just want to caution you, though, from being one of those guys who gets out a Vine's dictionary or something, a Greek dictionary, and begins to try to find nuances and shades of meaning in the Greek that can help, alter what's written there, and then you come up with your own translation using, the alternate meanings of Greek words. Do you understand? That's what the scholars who put together all of our translations have tried to do already. So when you're reading the English, you're reading people who have dug into the Greek and do it basically for a living. Okay, so be very cautious. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that next time because it's, I think, worth talking about. Okay, so I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.